Phoenicia was an ancient Semitic thalassocratic civilization situated on the western, coastal part of the Fertile Crescent and centered on the coastline of modern Syria and Lebanon. All major Phoenician cities were on the coastline of the Mediterranean, some colonies reaching the western Mediterranean. It was an enterprising maritime trading culture that spread across the Mediterranean from 1500 BC to 300 BC. The Phoenicians used the galley, a man-powered sailing vessel, and accredited with the invention of the bireme, by their innovations in shipbuilding and seafaring. The Phoenicians were enabled to sail as far west as present-day Morocco and Spain, carrying huge cargoes of goods for trade. They were famed in classical Greece and Rome as traders in purple, referring to their monopoly on the precious purple dye of the murex snail, used, among other things, for royal clothing, and for the spread of their alphabets, from which almost all modern phonetic alphabets are derived. Although Egyptian seafaring expeditions had already been made to Byblos to bring back Lebanon cedars as early as the 3rd millennium BC, continuous contact only occurred in the Egyptian New Empire period. In the Amarna tablets of the 14th century BC, people from the region called themselves Kenani or Kinani. Much later, in the 6th century BC, Hecataeus of Miletus writes that Phoenicia was formerly called Kainu Alpha, a name Philo of Byblos later adopted into his mythology as his eponym for the Phoenicians, Khna, who was afterwards called Phoenix. Phoenicia is really a classical Greek term used to refer to the region of the major Canaanite port towns, and does not correspond exactly to a cultural identity that would have been recognized by the Phoenicians themselves. The term in Greek means land of purple, a reference to the valuable murex shell dye they exported. It is uncertain to what extent the Phoenicians viewed themselves as a single ethnicity and nationality. Their civilization was organized in city-states, similar to ancient Greece. However, in terms of archaeology, language, lifestyle and religion, there is little to set the Phoenicians apart as markedly different from other Semitic cultures of Canaan. As Canaanites, they were unique in their remarkable seafaring achievements. Each city-state was a politically independent unit. They could come into conflict and one city might be dominated by another city-state, although they would collaborate in leagues or alliances. Though ancient boundaries of such city-centered cultures fluctuated, the city of Tyre seems to have been the southernmost. Sarepta between Sidon and Tyre is the most thoroughly excavated city of the Phoenician homeland. The Phoenicians were the first state-level society to make extensive use of alphabets. The Phoenician alphabet is generally held to be the ancestor of almost all modern alphabets. They spoke Phoenician, a Semitic language of the Canaanite subgroup, closely related to Hebrew. However, due to the very slight differences in language, and the insufficient records of the time, whether Phoenician formed a separate and united dialect, or was merely a superficially defined part of a broader language continuum, is unclear. Through their maritime trade, the Phoenicians spread the use of the alphabet to North Africa and Europe, where it was adopted by the Greeks, who later transmitted it to the Romans. In addition to their many inscriptions, the Phoenicians are believed to have left numerous other types of written sources, but most have not survived. Etymology. The oldest attested form of the word is the Mycenaean Poniki Jo, Poniki, ultimately borrowed from ancient Egyptian FNHW, Asiatics, Semites. The folk etymological association of Phoeniki with Phoenix mirrors that in Akkadian, which tied Kinani, Kinara, Canaan, Phoenicia, to Kinahu, red-dyed wool. The land was natively known as Nots-En, remembered in the 6th century BC by Hecataeus under the Greek form Chna, and its people as the Nots-Ny. Origins. 3200–1200 BC. Herodotus' account refers to the myths of Io and Europa. According to the Persians best informed in history, the Phoenicians began the quarrel. These people, who had formerly dwelt on the shores of the Erythraean Sea, having migrated to the Mediterranean and settled in the parts which they now inhabit, began at once, they say, to adventure on long voyages, freighting their vessels with the wares of Egypt and Assyria. Herodotus, the Greek historian Strabo, believed that the Phoenicians originated from Bahrain. Herodotus also believed that the homeland of the Phoenicians was Bahrain. This theory was accepted by the 19th-century German classicist Arnold Heeren, who said that, in the Greek geographers, for instance, we read of two islands, named Tyrus or Tylus, and Arad, Bahrain, which boasted that they were the mother country of the Phoenicians, and exhibited relics of Phoenician temples. The people of Tyre in particular have long maintained Persian Gulf origins, and the similarity in the words Tylus and Tyre has been commented upon. However, there is little evidence of occupation at all in Bahrain during the time when such migration had supposedly taken place. High point. 1200 to 800 BC. Fernand Braudel remarked in The Perspective of the World that Phoenicia was an early example of a world economy, surrounded by empires. The high point of Phoenician culture and sea power is usually placed c. 1200 to 800 BC. Archaeological evidence consistent with this understanding has been difficult to identify. A unique concentration in Phoenicia of silver hoards dated between 1200 and 800 BC, however, contains hack silver with lead isotope ratios matching ores in Sardinia and Spain. This metallic evidence agrees with the biblical memory of a Western Mediterranean Tarshish that supplied Solomon with silver via Phoenicia during the latter's heyday. The oldest finds in connection with the Phoenicians were made in the area of the modern port of Huelva, the ancient city of Onoba. Many of the most important Phoenician settlements had been established long before this. Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Simyra, Arwad, and Berytus all appear in the Amarna tablets. Archaeology has identified cultural elements of the Phoenician zenith as early as the 3rd millennium BC. The League of Independent City-State Ports, with others on the islands and along other coasts of the Mediterranean Sea, was ideally suited for trade between the Levant area, rich in natural resources, and the rest of the ancient world. Around 1200 BC, a series of poorly understood events weakened and destroyed the adjacent Egyptian and Hittite empires. In the resulting power vacuum, a number of Phoenician cities rose as significant maritime powers. Phoenician societies rested on three power bases: the king, temples and the priests, and councils of elders. Byblos first became the predominant center from where the Phoenicians dominated the Mediterranean and Erythraean sea routes. It was here that the first inscription in the Phoenician alphabet was found, on the sarcophagus of Hiram. Later, Tyre gained in power. One of its kings, the priest Ithobal, ruled Phoenicia as far north as Beirut, and part of Cyprus. Carthage was founded in 814 BC under Pygmalion of Tyre. The collection of city-states constituting Phoenicia came to be characterized by outsiders and the Phoenicians as Cydonia or Tyria. Phoenicians and Canaanites alike were called Sidonians or Tyrians, as one Phoenician city came to prominence after another. Decline. 539–65 BC. Persian rule. Cyrus the Great conquered Phoenicia in 539 BC. The Persians divided Phoenicia into four vassal kingdoms: Sidon, Tyre, Arwad, and Byblos. They prospered, furnishing fleets for the Persian kings. Phoenician influence declined after this. It is likely that much of the Phoenician population migrated to Carthage and other colonies following the Persian conquest. In 350 or 345 BC, a rebellion in Sidon, led by Tennis, was crushed by Artaxerxes III. Its destruction was described by Diodorus Siculus. Greek rule. Alexander the Great took Tyre in 332 BC after the siege of Tyre. Alexander was exceptionally harsh to Tyre, executing 2,000 of the leading citizens, but he maintained the king in power. He gained control of the other cities peacefully. The ruler of Aradis submitted, the king of Sidon was overthrown. The rise of Macedon gradually ousted the remnants of Phoenicia's former dominance over the eastern Mediterranean trade routes. Phoenician culture disappeared entirely in the motherland. Carthage continued to flourish in North Africa. It oversaw the mining of iron and precious metals from Iberia, and used its considerable naval power and mercenary armies to protect commercial interests. Rome finally destroyed it in 146 BC, at the end of the Punic Wars. Following Alexander, the Phoenician homeland was controlled by a succession of Macedonian rulers: Laomedon, Ptolemy I, Antigonus II, Demetrius, and Seleucus. Between 286 and 197 BC, Phoenicia fell to the Ptolemies of Egypt, who installed the high priests of Astarte as vassal rulers in Sidon. In 197 BC, Phoenicia along with Syria reverted to the Seleucids. The region became increasingly Hellenized, although Tyre became autonomous in 126 BC, followed by Sidon in 111. Syria, including Phoenicia, was seized and ruled by King Tigranes the Great of Armenia from 82 until 69 BC, when he was defeated by Lucullus. In 65 BC, Pompey finally incorporated the territory as part of the Roman province of Syria. Phoenicia became a separate province, California. 200 AD. Demographics. Genetic studies. A study by Pierre Zalwa and others claimed that 6 subclades of haplogroup J2 in particular, were a Phoenician signature amongst modern male populations tested in the coastal Lebanese Phoenician heartland and the broader area of the rest of the Levant, followed by Cyprus and South Turkey, then Crete, then Malta and East Sicily, then South Sardinia, Ibiza, and southern Spain, and, finally, coastal Tunisia and cities like Tingris in Morocco. This deliberately sequential sampling represented an attempt to develop a methodology that could link the documented historical expansion of a population with a particular geographic genetic pattern or patterns. The researchers suggested that the proposed genetic signature stemmed from a common source of related lineages rooted in Lebanon. None of the geographical communities tested, Zalwa pointed out subsequently, carried significantly higher levels of the proposed Phoenician signature than the others. This suggested that genetic variation preceded religious variation and divisions, and by the time it became Phoenicia, Lebanon already had well-differentiated communities with their own genetic peculiarities, but not significant differences, and religions came as layers of paint on top. Another study found evidence for genetic persistence on the island of Ibiza. Economy. Trade. The Phoenicians were among the greatest traders of their time and owed much of their prosperity to trade. At first, they traded mainly with the Greeks, trading wood, slaves, glass and powdered Tyrian purple. Tyrian purple was a violet purple dye used by the Greek elite to color garments. In fact, the word Phoenician derives from the ancient Greek word phoinios, meaning purple. As trading and colonizing spread over the Mediterranean, Phoenicians and Greeks seem to have split that sea in two. The Phoenicians sailed along and eventually dominated the southern shore, while the Greeks were active along the northern shores. The two cultures rarely clashed, mainly in Sicily, which eventually settled into two spheres of influence, the Phoenician West and the Greek East. In the centuries after 1200 BC, the Phoenicians were the major naval and trading power of the region. Phoenician trade was founded on the Tyrian purple dye, a violet purple dye derived from the shell of the Murex sea snail. once profusely available in coastal waters of the eastern Mediterranean Sea but exploited to local extinction. James B. Pritchard's excavations at Sarepta in present-day Lebanon revealed crushed murex shells and pottery containers stained with the dye that was being produced at the site. The Phoenicians established a second production center for the dye in Mogador, in present-day Morocco. Brilliant textiles were a part of Phoenician wealth, and Phoenician glass was another export ware to Egypt, where grapevines would not grow. The 8th century Phoenicians sold wine. The wine trade with Egypt is vividly documented by the shipwrecks located in 1997 in the open sea 50 kilometers west of Ascalon. Pottery kilns at Tyre and Sarepta produced the big terracotta jars used for transporting wine from Egypt. The Phoenicians bought Nubian gold. Additionally, great cedar logs were traded with lumber poor Egypt for significant sums. Sometime between 1075 and 1060 BC, an Egyptian envoy by the name of Wenamin visited Phoenicia and secured 7 great cedar logs in exchange for a mixed cargo including 4 crocks and 1 catman of gold, 5 silver jugs, 10 garments of royal linen, 10 curd of good linen from Upper Egypt, 500 rolls of finished papyrus, 500 cows' hides, 500 ropes, 20 bags of lentils and 30 baskets of fish. Those logs were then moved by ship from Phoenicia to Egypt. From elsewhere, they obtained other materials, perhaps the most important being silver from Sardinia and the Iberian Peninsula. Tin was required, which when smelted with copper from Cyprus created the durable metal alloy bronze. The archaeologist Glenn Marco suggests that tin may have been acquired from Galicia by way of the Atlantic coast or southern Spain. Alternatively, it may have come from northern Europe via the Rhone Valley and coastal Massalia. Strabo states that there was a highly lucrative Phoenician trade with Britain for tin via the Cassiterrides, whose location is unknown but may have been off the northwest coast of the Iberian Peninsula. Professor Timothy Champion, discussing Diodorus Siculus's comments on the tin trade, states that Diodorus never actually says that the Phoenicians sailed to Cornwall. In fact, he says quite the opposite. The production of Cornish tin was in the hands of the natives of Cornwall, and its transport to the Mediterranean was organized by local merchants by sea and then overland through France, well outside Phoenician control. Tarshish occurs in the Hebrew Bible with several uncertain meanings, and one of the most recurring is that Tarshish is a place, probably a city or country, that is far from the land of Israel by sea, where trade occurs with Israel and Phoenicia. It was a place where Phoenicians reportedly obtained different metals, particularly silver, during the reign of Solomon. The Septuagint, the Vulgate and the Targum of Jonathan render Tarshish as Carthage, but other biblical commentators read it as Tartessus, perhaps in ancient Hispania. William F. Albright and Frank M. Cross suggested Tarshish might be or was Sardinia because of the discovery of the Nora stone and Nora fragment, the former of which mentions Tarshish in its Phoenician inscription. Christine M. Thompson identified a concentration of hack silver hoards dating between c. 1200 and 586 BC in Israel and the Palestinian territories. This silver dominance as Jordan corpus is unparalleled in the contemporary Mediterranean, and within it occurs a unique concentration in Phoenicia of silver hoards dated between 1200 and 800 BC. Hack silver objects in these Phoenician hoards have lead isotope ratios that match ores in Sardinia and Spain. This metallic evidence agrees with the biblical memory of a western Mediterranean Tarshish that supplied Solomon with silver via Phoenicia. Assyrian records indicate Tarshish was an island, and the poetic construction of Psalm chapter 72 points to its identity as a large island in the west, the island of Sardinia. The Phoenicians established commercial outposts throughout the Mediterranean, the most strategically important being Carthage in North Africa, directly across the narrow straits. Ancient Gaelic mythologies attribute a Phoenician, Scythian influx to Ireland by a leader called Phoenicia. Others also sailed south along the coast of Africa. A Carthaginian expedition led by Hanno the Navigator explored and colonized the Atlantic coast of Africa as far as the Gulf of Guinea, and according to Herodotus, a Phoenician expedition sent down the Red Sea by Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt even circumnavigated Africa and returned through the Pillars of Hercules. After 3 years, using gold obtained by expansion of the African coastal trade following the Hanno expedition, Carthage minted gold status in 350 BC bearing a pattern in the reverse exig of the coins, which Mark McMenamin has controversially argued could be interpreted as a map. According to McMenamin, the Mediterranean is represented as a rectangle in the center, a triangle to the right represents India in the east, and an irregular shape on the left represents America to the west. In the 2nd millennium BC, the Phoenicians traded with the Somalis. Through the Somali city-states of Mosulon, Opone, Malaro, Sarapian, Mundus and Taba, trade flourished. Phoenician ships. The Greeks had 2 names for Phoenician ships, hippoi and galloi. Galloi means tubs and hippoi means horses. These names are readily explained by depictions of Phoenician ships in the palaces of Assyrian kings from the 7th and 8th centuries, as the ships in these images are tub-shaped and have horse heads on the ends of them. It is possible that these hippoi come from Phoenician connections with the Greek god Poseidon. Depictions that tell Balawat gates are found in the palace of Shalmaneser III, an Assyrian king, near Nimrud. They are made of bronze, and they portray ships coming to honor Shalmaneser. The Khorsabad Bar Relief shows the transportation of timber from Lebanon. It is found in the palace built specifically for Sargon II, another Assyrian king, at Khorsabad, now northern Iraq.